Mount Fuji, Japan's tallest mountain at 3,776 meters, stands as one of the nation's most iconic natural features. Each year, the official climbing window begins in early July and ends around mid-September. Outside this period, monitoring stations shut down, rescue services are unavailable, and trails are formally closed to the public. Under these conditions, the mountain becomes far more dangerous. Ice covers large sections of the terrain. Winds near the summit can exceed 100 kilometers per hour. Temperatures can plunge as low as -30 degrees Celsius. Even with these clear risks, individuals continue attempting the ascent. Some never make it back. In June 2024, 53-year-old Ero Takahashi climbed Mount Fuji just before the official season began. He reached the summit, taking photographs and sending them to his family in real time. This detail is critical. Takahashi showed no signs of confusion or distress. He remained aware, communicating, and documenting his progress. Then, without warning, images stopped and contact ceased. When search teams reached the summit, they discovered his body inside the crater. This location was unusual. The crater is not part of the normal climbing route. It requires a deliberate descent separate from the main path. More striking, 3 additional bodies were found nearby. 4 individuals in total. Each had climbed independently at different times without any connection. None had met. Yet all ended up in the same place, inside the crater of a volcano nearly 4,000 meters high. No official cause of death was publicly confirmed for any of them. Mount Fuji's crater forms a large depression measuring roughly 780 meters across and about 240 meters deep. Entering it requires a conscious decision to leave the safety of the summit rim. Standard routes do not lead downward into it. The terrain creates a funnel effect, where winds can behave unpredictably and intensify. Additionally, volcanic gases, mainly carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, can accumulate in lower areas. These gases displace oxygen, forming invisible zones where breathing becomes impossible. A person entering such an area may lose consciousness almost instantly without realizing the danger. This makes gas exposure a technically valid explanation. Carbon dioxide, being heavier than air, settles in enclosed depressions. Once inhaled in sufficient concentration, it can render a person unconscious within seconds, as if power had suddenly been cut. That could explain why none of the victims called for help or attempted escape. However, it fails to explain a more fundamental question. Why did 4 unrelated individuals, arriving at separate times, all choose to descend into the crater? Why that exact location instead of remaining on the summit rim where climbers typically stay? By the autumn of 2025, Japanese media outlets began identifying a recurring pattern involving climbers. Tourists, many from China, though not exclusively, were repeatedly attempting to scale Mount Fuji during the closed season, including late autumn, winter, and early spring. Most did so without proper equipment, without informing authorities, and often alone. Some were intercepted at lower checkpoints or warned by residents. Others continued upward and died in the attempt. In March 2026, authorities confirmed the identities of 2 more victims, a 23-year-old woman from Sweden and a 51-year-old man from New Zealand. Both had perished while climbing the mountain during winter, outside the official season. Police and rescue teams faced an increasingly difficult situation to interpret. The standard explanation for such incidents is straightforward. A tourist underestimates the challenge, lacks preparation, and is overtaken by severe weather. This reasoning accounts for isolated cases. But when the same behavior appears repeatedly across individuals from different countries and backgrounds, the explanation becomes insufficient. A young Swedish traveler, a middle-aged New Zealander, and numerous Chinese tourists, all untrained for extreme winter climbing, made the same decision to ascend Mount Fuji under hazardous conditions. One explanation centers on the influence of social media. In winter, Mount Fuji becomes visually striking. Its snow-covered cone reflects across nearby lakes, creating near-perfect symmetry. The absence of crowds enhances the sense of isolation. Content showcasing winter ascents often attracts millions of views, and creators who document off-season climbs present them as rare, exclusive experiences. The process unfolds in a predictable way. A viewer watches compelling footage, which distorts their perception of risk. Seeing others succeed creates the impression that the climb is manageable. As a result, the perceived danger decreases. Meanwhile, those who fail do not share their outcomes, leaving no visible record of consequences. This imbalance hides the true level of risk and reinforces the illusion of safety. In response, Japanese authorities introduced stricter measures in 2025. These included physical barriers blocking trail access, financial penalties for off-season climbing, and informational campaigns delivered in both Chinese and English. Despite these efforts, the impact remained limited, highlighting how difficult it is to alter behavior once a pattern becomes normalized. Beyond these surface-level factors lies another element often overlooked. Mount Fuji is still an active volcanic system. Although its last eruption occurred in 1707, it continues to release gases through fumaroles, small openings in the ground found within the crater and along its slopes. Low concentrations of carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds, not high enough to cause immediate unconsciousness, can still interfere with normal brain function. The effects develop gradually. Disorientation appears first, followed by reduced fear, weakened judgment, and an altered emotional state that can resemble mild euphoria. A person remains physically capable of movement and continues making decisions, yet their ability to evaluate danger becomes compromised. They may not recognize that they have entered a life-threatening environment. This type of cognitive disruption offers a possible explanation for why individuals continued climbing higher or moving deeper into the crater, when rational judgment would have told them to stop. It could clarify why Takahashi, despite his experience, descended into the crater, and why unprepared tourists continue forward during severe storms, as their perception of risk may have been altered by prolonged exposure to volcanic gases. However, this hypothesis remains unverified. There have been no systematic studies publicly released examining how Mount Fuji's volcanic emissions might influence human decision-making in real climbing conditions. Japanese geological authorities have not issued any official statements connecting gas exposure to the fatalities observed on the mountain. The events of June 24, 2024 remain particularly difficult to interpret because of a detail that does not fit any clear logical pattern. 4 individuals, each climbing alone and at different times, ended up in the exact same location inside the crater. If each person made an independent navigational mistake, then 4 separate errors led to the same point, which is statistically unlikely. If volcanic gases impaired their thinking, that would require a similar effect occurring across different individuals at different times. If they intentionally entered the crater, then the question becomes why they all made the same decision. The cause of death for all 4 individuals has never been officially confirmed. This leaves 2 possibilities. Either the autopsies did not yield a definitive answer, or the findings exist but have not been publicly disclosed. On August 17, 2001, a 43-year-old office worker from Osaka named Hiroyuki Watanabe set out on a hiking route in the Hida Range, located in the northern Japanese Alps. He did not return. His body was eventually discovered on October 3, 2003, 2 years and approximately 6 weeks after his disappearance. The location of discovery was 670 meters higher than the point where he was last seen. The official cause of death was hypothermia. The estimated time of death was late autumn or winter of the same year he vanished. His whereabouts during the 2-year interval remain unknown. Hiroyuki Watanabe was not inexperienced. For 15 consecutive years, he had spent part of his summer hiking in the mountains. The Japanese Alps were familiar territory. He understood the terrain, could interpret weather conditions, and selected appropriate equipment for his trips. His routine was consistent. He worked in an office in Osaka, maintained a family life, and followed a yearly pattern of mountain excursions. In August 2001, he selected a route leading toward Mount Yarigatake, one of Japan's most recognized peaks. The mountain stands at 3,180 meters and is known for its sharp, spear-like summit. For a skilled hiker, the journey typically requires 2 to 4 days, depending on conditions and pace. Standard safety protocol in Japan requires hikers to register their route at a mountain hut, including their planned return date. Hiroyuki followed this procedure. He recorded his itinerary and departed as scheduled. His plan was to complete the route and return within 3 days. When he failed to return or establish contact after that time, his family notified rescue services. Search operations in Japan are conducted with a high level of organization and seriousness. The country has a long-standing mountaineering culture, and missing persons in mountainous regions are treated as urgent cases. The search began without delay. At an elevation of approximately 2,800 meters along the trail, rescuers located Hiroyuki's backpack. It was positioned carefully against a rock beside the path. There were no signs of panic or struggle. The bag appeared deliberately placed, as if he intended to come back for it shortly. All zippers were closed. Inside were essential items including food, water, spare clothing, a map, and a sleeping bag. None of these had been disturbed. The placement of the backpack raised immediate questions. An experienced hiker would not willingly separate from critical supplies, even for a short detour. If he had been forced off the trail by an external factor, he would have taken these items with him. If he had paused to rest, standard behavior would involve returning to the pack. The situation indicated a break in normal cause and effect decision-making. From the location of the backpack, visible tracks extended away from the trail. Boot prints marked a path leading uphill, diverging from the established route. Rescuers followed these tracks for approximately 300 meters until they reached the boundary of a dense coniferous forest. At that point, the tracks vanished on a rocky surface just before the forest entrance. The search team deployed 4 trained dogs. Each was given an item from the backpack to identify the scent of its owner. The dogs successfully picked up the trail and moved in the same direction as the footprints ascending toward the forest. Upon reaching the forest edge, all 4 animals stopped simultaneously. Their behavior changed immediately. They began to whine softly. Their ears flattened and their tails dropped. None of them advanced into the forest. Handlers attempted to guide them forward and issued commands to continue tracking. The dogs refused. Some attempted to retreat, resisting further movement into the wooded area. The rescuers proceeded into the forest without the dogs. At this elevation, a coniferous forest forms a dense and dim environment, with tightly packed trees and heavy undergrowth limiting visibility and movement. The team spread out and moved several hundred meters in multiple directions, carefully scanning the ground and surrounding area. There were no signs of Hiroyuki, no broken branches, no disturbed soil, no footprints, and no indication that anyone had passed through. The forest remained still and undisturbed. All 4 dogs had lost the scent at exactly the same point, right at the forest boundary. This did not occur gradually or at different locations. It happened simultaneously, with identical reactions from each animal. In search and rescue practice, this pattern is interpreted clearly. It indicates a complete loss of the scent trail. Either the missing individual never entered the forest, or they did so in a way that left no detectable trace. The search operation was expanded immediately. Teams began combing the terrain both above and below the disappearance point. Trails within several kilometers were examined in detail. Stream banks, ravines, and potential shelter areas were inspected. Nearby mountain huts were contacted in case Hiroyuki had altered his route and taken refuge elsewhere. Hikers who had been on the trail around the same time were interviewed. None reported seeing him after his initial registration at the hut. Other huts confirmed they had not encountered him. No additional tracks appeared on any trail. Dangerous slopes and narrow gorges were searched thoroughly. The result remained unchanged. No evidence was found. After several weeks of effort, the search was officially suspended. The case was classified as a disappearance in the mountains, with the assumption of death but without recovery of a body. His family was left without any clear explanation of what had occurred. On October 3, 2003, 2 years after the initial disappearance, a group of mushroom gatherers made an unexpected discovery. Collecting wild mushrooms is a common seasonal activity in Japan's mountainous regions during autumn. While moving through a remote section of forest, they found a human body. The location was recorded at an elevation of 3,480 meters. This placed it 670 meters higher than the point where Hiroyuki's backpack had been found and where the dogs had lost the trail. Official identification confirmed the remains as Hiroyuki Watanabe. The body was positioned at the base of a tree. This tree held particular significance. Local residents recognized it as a shimoku, considered sacred within Shinto tradition and believed to house a mountain spirit known as a kami. Such trees are typically distinguished by unusual age or form and are often marked with ceremonial ropes called shimenawa. They have long been regarded with respect and caution by those familiar with the area. Hiroyuki's body lay directly at the roots of this tree. His clothing was not scattered. Instead, every item had been removed and folded, carefully into a neat pile placed beside him, similar to how a person might arrange their clothes before sleeping. He was completely unclothed. The official report listed hypothermia as the cause of death. This detail introduces a major contradiction. If he disappeared in August 2001 but was found 2 years later, the timeline raises immediate questions. The most basic issue is determining when he actually died. One possibility is that he died shortly after going missing, perhaps within the first few weeks. The location where his body was eventually found may have been overlooked during the initial search due to difficult terrain. 2 years later, the mushroom gatherers happened to encounter what search teams had missed. However, this explanation conflicts with environmental conditions. August in the Japanese Alps is not typically associated with fatal hypothermia. At elevations around this level, daytime temperatures range between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius. Nighttime temperatures can drop to between 2 and 4 degrees. Hypothermia can occur under these conditions, but it usually requires additional factors, such as prolonged exposure to moisture, immobility, and lack of insulation. This leads to a critical question. Why would he remove all his clothing during this period? Medical science recognizes a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. In advanced stages of hypothermia, individuals may experience a false sensation of warmth and begin removing their clothes. However, this behavior typically occurs when body temperature has already dropped below approximately 32 degrees Celsius, a stage close to death. At that point, cognitive function is severely impaired. In documented cases, clothing is usually found scattered rather than neatly arranged. The organized placement of Hiroyuki's clothes does not align with this pattern. A second possibility is that he did not die in August. Although the autopsy identified hypothermia, determining an exact time of death from remains discovered after 2 years is not precise. The margin of uncertainty can extend across several months. If he remained alive into the colder seasons of late autumn or winter between 2001 and 2002, then hypothermia becomes a more plausible cause of death based on environmental conditions. This scenario introduces another unresolved issue. Survival in the northern Japanese Alps during winter is extremely difficult. Temperatures can drop to -20 degrees Celsius at higher elevations, accompanied by heavy snowfall and strong winds. Without proper equipment, survival for extended periods is not feasible. Hiroyuki's backpack, which contained food and a sleeping bag, had been left behind on the trail. No mountain huts reported sheltering him. No hikers reported encountering him. Extensive search operations conducted across 2 seasons failed to detect any trace of his presence. A third possibility involves the factor of altitude. The body was located 670 meters above the original point of disappearance. This was not simply a different spot within the forest. It required a sustained ascent through difficult terrain, moving upward from the lower slopes to a height that exceeded the highest sections of the Japanese Alps along the route he had initially planned, but approached from an entirely different direction. The dogs lost the scent at the lower boundary of the forest. The body was discovered above that forest, near a solitary tree positioned in a more open area. If Hiroyuki had traveled through the forest on his own, the search dogs should have been able to continue tracking his scent within that space. If he did not pass through the forest, then the question remains how he reached a higher elevation, beyond it. The presence of the tree is not neutral within the cultural framework of Japan. In Shinto belief, mountains, ancient trees, and waterfalls are considered dwellings of kami, forces or entities associated with nature that are not equivalent to gods in a Western sense, but are understood to possess intention and influence. Within this tradition, mountain spirits are often referred to as Yatsutsu Kami, beings connected to peaks and wilderness areas that may appear in human or animal form, guiding or misleading travelers and drawing them away from established paths. Traditional Accounts include numerous descriptions of individuals who vanish within mountainous regions. The concept is known as kami kakushi, which translates directly as being hidden by a god. In such narratives, a person disappears without leaving evidence, sometimes reappearing years later with no memory of where they have been, and in other cases never returning at all. Within folklore, this is treated not as symbolic language but as a literal explanation for events that cannot be understood through ordinary reasoning. The fact that Hiroyuki's body was found at the base of a shimoku, a tree regarded in local belief as a dwelling place of a kami, does not hold scientific weight on its own. It may be coincidence. However, when considered alongside the other elements of the case, a pattern of unresolved details emerges. A man disappears after leaving his equipment behind. Search dogs halt simultaneously at the forest edge. The body appears 2 years later at a higher elevation. Each element lacks a clear explanation, and together they reinforce the absence of a coherent sequence of events. The condition of the clothing remains one of the most difficult aspects to interpret. The items were not scattered or damaged. They were not removed hastily and left where they fell. Instead, every piece had been folded carefully into a neat arrangement. This indicates a controlled and deliberate action. In cases of hypothermia involving paradoxical undressing, behavior is typically disorganized. Individuals remove clothing rapidly under the false sensation of overheating, often tearing at garments and leaving them spread irregularly across the area. The observed arrangement does not match that pattern. There are cultural practices within certain Japanese mountain traditions that involve symbolic acts of removal or abandonment of possessions. Practitioners associated with Yamabushi ascetic practices sometimes engage in rituals that represent detachment from material items, including clothing. However, Hiroyuki Watanabe was not known to participate in such traditions. He was an office worker with a consistent lifestyle and no indication of religious ascetic practice. Investigators did not assign any interpretation to the folded clothing. It remained documented as an unexplained fact. Officially, the case is closed. The body was recovered, and the cause of death was recorded as hypothermia. Beyond that, the circumstances remain unresolved. The exact time of death could not be determined. The location where he spent the period between his disappearance and death was never identified. The reason he traveled 670 meters above the original point of disappearance without essential equipment was not established. The backpack, containing food, water, and a sleeping bag, was preserved as evidence. It had been placed carefully beside the trail, positioned in a way that suggested he intended to return for it. He did not return. Not to the backpack, not to the route, and not to those waiting for him. The sequence of events remains incomplete. A disappearance in August. A body found years later in a location difficult to reconcile with known movement. No clear path connecting the 2 points. The remaining evidence consists of a backpack set against a rock, the reaction of 4 search dogs stopping at the forest edge, and a set of clothes folded at the base of a tree regarded as sacred.